Question for Oliver, Gynna.
I don't have questions, but I do have comments for Oliver because I'm a classification nerd, I guess. So I was wondering if you've read Bowker and Starr, obviously, memory practices, and that's kind of the seminal text to also read for the consequences of classification. And it's like, again, it's the same argument, but I find this case very illustrative. And I want to draw it back to and give an example of India. So I moonlight as a user experience researcher. And last summer, I was helping this big tech company build a job platform. So the whole thrust right now, apart from smart cities, is to kind of enroll the enroll the youth of India, because it's a youth explosion, and make them all digitized and get them jobs and whatnot. And so I was tasked with designing something like that. And what we found, obviously, was that in India, for example, there are neighborhoods that are not just sort of innocuous geographies, right? So they are actually formations of caste, class, gender, religion, and so on. And then when I went back to the designers of this platform, and I was telling them that even instituting something like proximity-based job search is actually sort of a dilemma. Like, are we matching people back to blue-collar jobs in poorer neighborhoods, and hence sort of driving them towards a futurity which is away from their class mobility and so on. And so that was one direction that I wanted to offer. And then I'm happy to talk about this more, but we're also writing something about how sort of this other corrective push in tech studies is around AI and ethics, right? So how do we sort of think about ethics in systems that are already built? And we've been trying to push and say, well, some of these things are already racialized formations to begin with. And I thought that this was an excellent case of, for example, even where houses are located and found in green zones is perhaps illustrative of a colonial or larger sort of history, or also an environmental futurity of where pollution lands up. So someone was telling me about how sort of the winds blow from east to west or something, and hence how cities might themselves be spaces that are ordered in this way. And I would love to talk more about the Indian context as well later.
Yeah, that'd be a pleasure.
Thanks both of you for really interesting presentations. I want to ask questions of both, but maybe I'll restrict myself and ask Ollie, and then if there's time, I'll ask Gynna. When you were presenting, Ollie, it's really interesting because it took me back, way back into kind of the really early 1990s Cambridge research, where I forget the name of this guy, he's now a professor there. He actually went around physically across all the houses in Cambridge, mapping which houses had roofs facing which direction, and then he put it on a spreadsheet. And in those days, it was basically in Excel, and then drawing from public data in terms of the conditions of houses, social demographics, etc., and effectively coming upon something quite similar in terms of what are the percentages of people can we think of. So I'm just wondering if this is literally, old wine in new bottles, and they're just trying to efficiently do this via digital technology. And the second question related to that is the categorization, the production of these new kinds of people who would be effectively consumers of their products. Isn't this also not really kind of the old-fashioned market research thing? Who would be most likely to buy your products are the people who are without kids, at that certain age with disposable income, et cetera, So how is that? I'm just curious to see how you have thought through that thing, which probably already happens with most of products that have to be sold, and kind of the really old-fashioned ways of actually doing this kind of studies to find out, what is the building stock that needs to be upgraded or can be retrofitted with particular kinds of solar energy products, which is very common, very popular in the 1990s in the UK. I'm just curious if you've thought about those. I'll ask later. Let's give an opportunity to others.
Just briefly to Gynna, thank you for the presentation. And also, when you start presentation and considering that you were talking about Colombia, I was expecting a little bit much more on on the consequences of a post-conflict society. I know that you mentioned slightly when you mentioned the referendum, and maybe it was not, but if you can extend a little bit, because I think that the consideration to the post-conflict in Northern Ireland, in the Basque Country, or in Colombia, I think is something that you should be considered straightforwardly. So, thank you.
So we have 3 more. So you want to answer these 3? We'll come back to the other 3. Otherwise, there'll be 6 questions. You'll have to remember what the questions are. So maybe just, just answer because they're quite. And then we have 3 more questions after this.
Shall I start? Or do you want to start? I think in response to your first question, is it old wine in new bottles? Yes, it is. I think the people who make the platform would probably argue that they're slightly cooler bottles, but nonetheless, yeah, I think the model is the same. That kind of conversation about market research, yes, actually, absolutely. But I think, again, there's kind of, I think that, kind of one of the reasons that we have these kind of conversations about smart is because we think that there is something different about cities as opposed to just kind of stuff that you buy. And I think that in that respect, I mean, it's certainly, this is kind of a new thought, I guess. So it's something that I'm working through, but I sort of, I would say that there's, because of the something important about, you don't have a choice about whether you live in a city, right? Well, you do, but for most of us, you live where you live. And then if the way that you're able to interact with or be in that city starts being marked by your consumer status, then it becomes more than consumer status, right? It becomes something about yourself. And so I suppose that's kind of where I'm going with that. And also, thanks very much for the references.
Well, thank you, Igor, for your question. Definitely, post-conflict is probably the main frame of my thesis. It wasn't before going. As a Colombian, I wasn't aware of, of this situation when I went back to my country. And when I started working with the people in the community, they all were under threat of death. So unfortunately, I just came back from Colombia literally 5 days ago. And I did my field work last year. And when I went back, the situation had dramatically changed for all the community leaders and the people who were involved in the production of those videos. They have been internally displaced in the same city, like they call it intra-urban displacement. And so basically they have to move, and the activities and the innovations that they were undertaking, of course, now are completely, what you say, like in different territories. So that network that I was mentioning is even they continue resisting, but it's like the state just like hitting into those kind of dissident groups and insurgent practices of citizenship, and so it's like kind of disaggregating that contestation. So of course, at the moment, Colombians are. The day-to-day worry is about peace building, and of course these communities are coming and trying to generate solutions, to give answers to how to build peace building, how to build peace in the territories, and more socially, grounded, and that is not about the state telling us how to make peace, but how we just build it from the territories. So, thank you.
Thanks, both of you. I guess this question could be picked up by either of you, but it's prompted by Oliver in particular, because when you were speaking, Oliver, you used the term platform a lot because you're talking about a platform, obviously. It uses the name platform in its name. I was just wondering if you could reflect a bit on what is a platform. And I was thinking particularly about Tarleton Gillespie, who writes about platform, and kind of talks a bit about the way platform does certain work, particularly for these large commercial entities like Facebook and Google, et cetera, that it has this metonymic quality. It can be used variously, it can be used very ambiguously. So we could be talking about a platform having technical qualities, or we could say, well, it's a platform for expression, or it's a platform for entrepreneurial opportunity, et cetera. And obviously one of the problems that emerges is that there's usually an implicit suggestion that platforms are neutral, maybe even immaterial. And obviously, the Cape platform, you're describing it as anything but neutral. But I was wondering if you could reflect a bit, and again, Gynna, you might want to pick up on this too, potentially, if platform is a term that's being used in your research also. But what kind of work does the term platform do, I guess? Or are platforms actually a coherent kind of entity? And I guess more broadly, maybe we should think about what kind of work platforms as ideas or things do in the metabolism of smart cities. It's something that gets thrown around a lot, but we tend to just use it in that same way without maybe reflecting on what platforms might be.
Okay, so because we need a bit time at the end for a roundtable discussion, maybe we could just two more.
Yeah, my question is to both of you as well as maybe all other speakers. After 3 talks on smart cities, I'm just struck by the way this might just be an instrument in conservative projects. So in, kind of stabilizing certain classes, excluding. So in other words, that they're doing more of the same things, that happened in, various pushes for gentrification. And I'm just, because initially one is thinking smart city is going to change the way we move in the city, innovative projects of doing it differently and totally differently, reimagining the city. But now what comes out of the research is there's a very strong drive towards conservative projects. And I just would like you to comment on it.
Just a complete follow-on, actually, on that. And it was about the framing of this final question, Oliver. Because I agree. I'm not sure it's a what if. I think we know that these classifications come out of projects that are owned by the capital-owning classes and who look to classify the rest of the city in ways that are productive for that capital, both locally but also globally, right? Global capital moving in and out of cities needs cities to be legible in a way that facilitates that movement. So I wonder if it's not so much a what-if question, but how we fight that classification. Maybe just a comment. I can't really. Just a comment.
Okay, yeah, a comment. Gynna, the ciudad digna. I don't speak Spanish. The just city, as you called it. The dignified city. You translated it as just city. I was trying to think about what equivalent slogan or story might be told here by some kind of body, alongside stories about innovative London or smart London. And the closest I could come to came out of the mayor's office, London, everybody welcome. I think that's a contemporary poster. But apart from that, we have no kind of discourse of justice within the sort of slogans that are told about London. So I'll ask you afterwards about who it is who's peddling that idea in Medellin. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So about 30 seconds.
Well, I'm going to comment on the idea of the smart city becoming a tool of gentrification and like more a tool for a more conservative agenda. Specifically, how is first, smart city doesn't exist in Medellin, but it's like kind of a status of the city, like kind of, it's going to embed, at some point, it's going to embed all these layers of technology somehow physically or even in the way that we interact. So, of course, in this specific area, in Comuna 8, as you could see in the map, I don't know if you remember it, but is the fringe, is the margin, as Katharine was saying before, is the smart city in the margin, and that border, that urban border, is becoming very contested. Urban land grabbing is happening. Communities that are being built in that area because they are displaced, because people come to the city, they don't have anywhere to stay, so these neighborhoods are becoming, bigger and bigger, and they're becoming more dense. So the project from the local government is to develop mega projects. And of course, people relate these mega projects to the idea of being the most innovative city in the world. So, of course, they relate this innovation, they just react, and there is everything that happened that relates to the idea of developing big infrastructure or becoming part of workshops or participate in events that are undertaken by the local authorities is just, it's just, definitely putting already a lot of ideas in people's mind around the idea of the smart cities.
Thanks. I thought all of those questions were really interesting. To go through in order, reflecting on that notion of a platform, I haven't actually, and that's a really interesting point. I think that it's a kind of an interesting one in the way in which smart city, because I'm not terribly fond of this notion of the smart city as this big kind of blob that somehow or other coheres, because I really don't think it does. And so I kind of regard platform as a sort of way in which people try and collect something around something that they're interested in. So the people around Cape sort of are interested in consumers, they're interested in social difference in one way or another, they're interested in roof angle, and a platform becomes a way that they can pull that together. And so my point would be that people are capable of making small platforms. I think that you might call it an app or something like that, but a platform just sounds a bit cooler. It's the second time I've used that word. I must expand my vocabulary. But yeah, so I think there's sort of something. Also, I think it's it's very interesting. I don't want to talk too much about the kind of people who made this Cape project, but it was a kind of particular cohort of, I think smart is very kind of connected to this cohort, old white men who want to sound like they're pretty hip. And so platform sounds better than, technology or something like that. This notion of smart as conservative and kind of connected to gentrification is again really interesting, and I think my point would be, and I suppose hopefully that last question, how do we fight the sort of classification of that's emerging through the capital owning classes, maybe fits into this response too a little bit. Smart doesn't have to take the form that it is taking. We did, and here's a little plug for you, our research project did BBC Radio 4 Thinking Aloud a couple of weeks ago, which was great, but really sadly they didn't include a fantastic question from someone who has been living in Milton Keynes from the outset, who said, this was a really exciting city when we first got here because there was a really kind of passionate governance process going on. There was also lots of money, there was lots of attempts at community building, and lots of people were brought together, and this seems to be diametrically opposite to the kind of way in which Milton Keynes is emerging as a smart city, where it's about austerity, it's about really there not being enough money to hold things together. So hopefully we can find, there must be another way of practicing smart. This is just one version of it.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to do that, but thank you. Okay. Thank you to both of you.